On behalf of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore and the UAE Embassy in Singapore, a very warm welcome to everyone joining us in today's webinar. My name is Aisha Al-Sarihi, and I am a research fellow at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. And it is my great pleasure to chair today's webinar titled From the UAE to Azerbaijan, COP29 Expectations and Challenges. We are very delighted to once again collaborate with the UAE Embassy in Singapore, who is co-hosting this webinar with us today. And actually, this is not the first webinar that we co-host with the Embassy, specifically on the COP topic. We also collaborated in other webinars previously. So to begin today's webinar, as we know, Azerbaijan is hosting COP29 in Baku in less than 3 weeks from now. Last year, COP28 was hosted in Dubai in the UAE. The expectations for UAE COP were extremely high, especially as its task was to complete the first global stocktake. And as and today, as the global community stands at a critical juncture at the half point between the Paris Agreement adopted in 2015 and the 2030 deadline for greenhouse gas emissions to decline by 43% in order to limit global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, the expectations for COP29 are also going to be even higher. So in this webinar today, we aim to build our discussion around a few important questions, including what are the key outcomes of COP28 and what are the expectations for COP29? What is next for the global stocktake? What the COP outcome means for countries' climate action at home? And to answer those questions and more, I am very pleased to be joined today by two esteemed speakers. Joining us from the UAE, Ms. Thuraya Al-Ali, who is a team lead of global stocktake negotiations at the COP28 committee of the UAE. And I'm also pleased to be joined by Mr. Peter, who is the Director General for Climate Negotiations at the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industry. Mr. Peter has been taken on his capacity several roles at the COP. He is going to be joining COP29 this year, also taking a track on the negotiations. And also in his capacity, he has been a co-chair and member of the Katowice Committee of Experts on Response Measures since its establishment in 2018, and he participated on the same capacity in COP26 and last year also at COP28, and I expect he is also going to do handle the profile for this year as well. So to begin our discussion, I think I will go right away to Thuraya. But before that, I also want to bring a reminder, a logistic reminder to everyone joining us. If you have any questions for our speakers and you have a specific question for each speaker, please feel free to write your questions on the chat box. So I would like to kick off the discussion with Thuraya. And Thuraya, being a lead at the COP28 committee, a lead in the negotiations and specifically for the global stocktake, I would like to ask you to highlight on the key outcomes of the COP28.
Have an active engagement here and to kind of give insight on what we did at COP28. So just to answer your question in terms of the key outcomes of COP28. So this was a historic COP, and all countries came together to deliver on the UAE consensus. which provided a set of ambitious and comprehensive set of negotiated outcomes under the UNFCCC process. And as you would know, like one of the key components of the UAE consensus was the decision on the GST. The GST outcome aims to assess the progress since Paris and how we put forward a plan to close the implementation gaps to 2030. We had a landmark agreement under the GST in order to bring a sectoral approach to the COP process, and it called on parties to transition away from fossil fuels in a just and orderly fashion, and also to triple renewables and double energy efficiency globally by 2030. It also included the need to peak global emissions by 2025 and to take into account different national starting points, whilst also encouraging parties to submit their economy-wide and nationally determined contributions. We also had the recognition of the crucial need to significantly scale up adaptation finance beyond doubling. And there was a clear call for countries to deliver their national adaptation plans by 2025 and implement them by 2030. Finally, recognizing the crucial role finance has to play in delivering ambition, the GST decision also builds momentum behind a new global climate finance architecture to support the post-2025 goal to be delivered at COP29. We also delivered on the Emirates framework for global climate resilience. The framework is a step change that will put adaptation, focus, and action on par with mitigation by galvanizing not just governments, but also non-party stakeholders to speed up and scale adaptation action. It set targets for a universal set themes essential for sustainable development and human well-being, which included, for example, food, water, health, shelter, livelihoods, nature, biodiversity, and culture. And it also set targets on how to approach adaptation at local to national levels. We also worked and, in a truly innovative fashion, we set up the fund for loss and damage on the first day of COP28. This new fund is to be hosted by the World Bank for an initial period of 4 years and will allocate resources based on available evidence with a minimum percentage allocated to the least developed countries and small NSITs. We also delivered on the Just Transition Work Program, which was only established at COP27. So this 5-year work program aims to drive ambitious, equitable implementation across all pillars of the Paris Agreement. And it continues the COP28 presidency's commitment to inclusion and includes references to labor rights and social protections as part of adaptation. We also delivered on the mitigation work program, which was established at COP26, and that effectively showcases opportunities and barriers to closing the ambition and implementation gap. We also highlighted that at COP28, we appointed a presidency youth climate champion, and we do hope that this is something that will continue over the course of the UNFCCC process. This was the first time a presidency delivered this type of initiative under the Paris Agreement. And we hope that this sets an example under the UNFCCC to encourage youth to have a voice in this space. We also delivered on the technology implementation program, which completed the ambitious package and set the tone for means of implementation going forward.
On behalf of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore and the UAE Embassy in Singapore, a very warm welcome to everyone joining us in today's webinar. My name is Aisha Al-Sarihi, and I am a research fellow at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. And it is my great pleasure to chair today's webinar titled From the UAE to Azerbaijan, COP29 Expectations and Challenges. We are very delighted to once again collaborate with the UAE Embassy in Singapore, who is co-hosting this webinar with us today. And actually, this is not the first webinar that we co-host with the embassy, specifically on the COP topic. We also collaborated in other webinars previously. So to begin today's webinar, as we know, Azerbaijan is hosting COP29 in Baku in less than 3 weeks from now. Last year, COP28 was hosted in Dubai in the UAE. The expectations for UAE COP were extremely high, especially as its task was to complete the first global stocktake. And today, as the global community stands at a critical juncture at the half point between the Paris Agreement adopted in 2015 and the 2030 deadline for greenhouse gas emissions to decline by 43% in order to limit global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, the expectations for COP29 are also going to be even higher. So in this webinar today, we aim to build our discussion around a few important questions, including what are the key outcomes of COP28 and what are the expectations for COP29? What is next for the global stocktake? What the COP outcome means for countries' climate action at home? And to answer those questions and more, I'm very pleased to be joined today by two esteemed speakers. Joining us from the UAE, Ms. Thuraya Al-Ali, who is a team lead of global stocktake negotiations at the COP28 committee of the UAE. And I'm also pleased to be joined by Mr. Peter, who is the Director General for Climate Negotiations at the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industry. Mr. Peter has been taken on his capacity several roles at the COP. He is going to be joining COP29 this year, also taking a track on the negotiations. And also in his capacity, he has been a co-chair and member of the Katowice Committee of Experts on Response Measures since its establishment in 2018. And he participated on the same capacity in COP26 and last year also at COP28. And I expect he is also going to do handle the profile for this year as well. So to begin our discussion, I think I will go right away to Thuraya. But before that, I also want to bring a reminder, a logistic reminder to everyone joining us. If you have any questions for our speakers and you have a specific question for each speaker, please feel free to write your questions on the chat box. So I would like to kick off the discussion with Thuraya. And Thuraya, being a lead at the COP28 committee, a lead in the negotiations and specifically for the global stocktake, I would like to ask you to highlight on the key outcomes of the COP28.
Thank you very much, Aisha. And first of all, I would just like to thank you for inviting me to this event. Very, very keen to have an active engagement here and to kind of give insight on what we did at COP28. So just to answer your question in terms of the key outcomes of COP28. So this was a historic COP, and all countries came together to deliver on the UAE consensus, which provided a set of ambitious and comprehensive set of negotiated outcomes under the UNFCCC process. And as you would know, like one of the key components of the UAE consensus was the decision on the GST. The GST outcome aims to assess the progress since Paris and how we put forward a plan to close the implementation gaps to 2030. We had a landmark agreement under the GST in order to bring a sectoral approach to the COP process, and it called on parties to transition away from fossil fuels in a just and orderly fashion, and also to triple renewables and double energy efficiency globally by 2030. It also included the need to peak global emissions by 2025 and to take into account different national starting points, whilst also encouraging parties to submit their economy-wide and nationally determined contributions. We also had the recognition of the crucial need to significantly scale up adaptation finance beyond doubling. And there was a clear call for countries to deliver their national adaptation plans by 2025 and implement them by 2030. Finally, recognizing the crucial role finance has to play in delivering ambition, the GST decision also builds momentum behind a new global climate finance architecture to support the post-2025 goal to be delivered at COP29. We also delivered on the Emirates framework for global climate resilience. The framework is a step change that will put adaptation, focus, and action on par with mitigation by galvanizing not just governments, but also non-party stakeholders to speed up and scale adaptation action. It set targets for a universal set themes essential for sustainable development and human well-being, which included, for example, food, water, health, shelter, livelihoods, nature, biodiversity, and culture. And it also set targets on how to approach adaptation at local to national levels. We also worked and, in a truly innovative fashion, we set up the fund for loss and damage on the first day of COP28. This new fund is to be hosted by the World Bank for an initial period of 4 years and will allocate resources based on available evidence with a minimum percentage allocated to the least developed countries and small NSITs. We also delivered on the Just Transition Work Program, which was only established at COP27. So this 5-year work program aims to drive ambitious, equitable implementation across all pillars of the Paris Agreement. And it continues the COP28 presidency's commitment to inclusion and includes references to labor rights and social protections as part of adaptation. We also delivered on the mitigation work program, which was established at COP26, and that effectively showcases opportunities and barriers to closing the ambition and implementation gap. We also highlighted that at COP28, we appointed a presidency youth climate champion, and we do hope that this is something that will continue over the course of the UNFCCC process. This was the first time a presidency delivered this type of initiative under the Paris Agreement. And we hope that this sets an example under the UNFCCC to encourage youth to have a voice in this space. We also delivered on the technology implementation program, which completed the ambitious package and set the tone for means of implementation going forward.
Thank you very much, Thoraya, for clearly outlining the key outcomes of COP28. Clearly, it is a plethora of different profiles that needs to be taken and advanced further in the next COP. I would like now to move to Peter, who is going to reflect on his participation at COP28. I know Peter has been a senior advisor to the UAE presidency of COP28 last year. So and you have slides, so I look forward to hear your reflections and what to expect from COP29.
Thank you very much, Shah. First, let me express my appreciation to the MEI and the UAE Embassy in Singapore for this webinar. Title is a very astute one, looking back and looking forward, expectation and challenges. I think it's a very important title. And also, on a personal note, it's very good to collaborate with Thoraya and UAE colleagues. I really was honored last year to given the opportunity to be part of the UAE presidency as a senior advisor to the UAE presidency. So good morning to everyone in the UAE and good afternoon to friends who are joining the webinar in Singapore. I have a few slides. Basically, I'm not just going to dwell on the outcomes at COP28, but I'm going to do a little bit of reflection, looking back and looking forward to Azerbaijan. Let me begin with a quote from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the speech he made on Earth Day in June this year. Just look at the part highlighted in red. He mentioned that we are not only in danger, we are the danger, but we are also the solution. I like to focus on his comments on us being the solution to the climate crisis. As human beings have consistently demonstrated through history, as we did during the COVID crisis, we can effectively combat climate change if we cooperate and work together. So in this regard, in the direction of forging the solutions, parties came together under the leadership of the UAE presidency to adopt the UAE consensus at COP28 in Dubai. I won't go into the details. Thoraya has already given us a flavor of the outcomes from COP28. But I just like to say that I've participated in 16 COPs from 2008, and I can actually say confidently that COP28 is perhaps the most substantive COP in terms of outcomes across the various pillars of the UNFCCC. If I can just cite 4 examples. Firstly, the inaugural global stocktake. Thoraya already spoken about that. Second, the first in any COP is the agreement for parties to transition away from fossil fuels. Next, the decision to accelerate the energy transition, such as tripling renewable energy capacity globally and doubling the global average annual rate of energy efficiency improvements by 2030. And last but not least, the launching of the UAE Just Transition Book Program. The COP28 outcomes on mitigation are significant. However, we must also applaud, as Thoraya mentioned earlier, the Emirates Framework for Global Climate Resilience. The framework placed adaptation on par with mitigation. The framework provides effect to our shared view. I believe all of us agree that parties are already experiencing the effects of climate change. Hence, there must also be urgent actions on adaptation efforts. It is indeed an inflection point in the UNFCCC process, but we cannot afford to sit on our laurels. We must keep up the momentum. In this regard, we welcome the IEA report released during the New York Climate Week in September 2024. I just pause here a minute so that the audience can have a look at the slides. As you can see, these are targets that the IEA has highlighted in order to effect some of the targets that we agreed to in COP28. In the spirit of keeping momentum, we need to be mindful of paragraph 191 of the UAE consensus relating to the roadmap to 1.5. If parties work together, mission 1.5 is not mission impossible. It is mission 1.5 possible. But parties must collectively enhance the various pillars on mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology, to name some areas. We all need to build a strong and sustainable, if I can use this terminology, Maison 1.5 to achieve the roadmap to 1.5. Well, in order to achieve mission 1.5, we need enablers. First, a new collective quantified goal on climate finance for adoption at COP29. In this regard, we welcome the efforts by the Troika to leading efforts to realize an agreement on the NCQC. Second, international cooperation is essential. In our view, speaking as a small island city-state, which is alternative energy disadvantage, I like to highlight that from our perspective, international cooperation has a number of strengths. First, there must be support for countries with limited renewable energy while ensuring energy security, affordability, and accessibility. Second, parties must work to remove barriers to the development of low-emission technologies such as hydrogen, energy storage, and CCUS. In this regard, we welcome the initiative of the incoming presidency, which has announced a clean hydrogen initiative. I think this is very important. So low carbon technologies such as hydrogen, energy storage, CCUS will open new pathways for net zero transition. Next, the promotion of an open and supportive international economic system to facilitate the transboundary flow of clean energy. Next, parties must work together to finalize carbon credit mechanism under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement at COP29. Fourth, how can we harness the potential of trade as an enabler for climate action? So I raise this as a question. Fifth, giving effect to the work on response measures. Parties need to work together to maximize the positive impacts while minimizing the adverse economic and social implications of response measures. Last but importantly, I think it's important that parties work to reskill and upskill workers to take advantage of the new and transformed employment opportunities in the green economy. So in this regard, I welcome Just Transition Work Program, which was adopted at COP28. In my view, technology is another fundamental enabler. It can be a game changer to realize Mission 1.5. In this regard, I'd like to quote from Professor Jeffrey Sachs from the University of Harvard. Basically, he has made the point very clearly that technological innovation and research and the development of clean and renewable energy technologies must be expedited for countries to have a chance to stabilize carbon emissions at levels, at the same time avoiding potentially devastating global costs. So mitigation actions are not costless, but technology will help us to alleviate such costs. Let me end with the following diagram. So I just want to put to the audience, in your view, where is the UNFCCC process now? COP28, as I mentioned, is certainly an inflection point, the most substantive COP in my view, but where are we heading? So how is COP29 going to build on the momentum that, that the UAE presidency had put together at COP28? So is it going to be ambition or failure? Is it going to be cooperation or conflict? Are we on track or is it a fractured effort? So I just want to leave this as a thought for all of us to reflect. And also remember the diagram I showed earlier about Maison 1.5. All of us must work towards the roadmap to 1.5. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I really liked your presentation and your highlight on that 1.5 mission is possible. And then the other thing, the final slide, I think it is provoking very important questions, including whether we need more COPs, how efficient the COPs are. And I'm going to go back to that point. But both of you and Thuraya, you highlighted in key elements that I want to follow up on. Climate finance and the transition away from the fossil fuels. Let me start with the transition away from the fossil fuels because it was a breakthrough of the COP28 last year. I would like to pose the question to both of you. What is next for the transition away from the fossil fuels? What are we going to expect from COP29 on the transition away from the fossil fuels? And the second element of my question is from practical point of view, how can countries, like for example, the UAE, can balance between the transition away from the fossil fuels and the, scale up the transition to cleaner energy resources? Shall I start with Thuraya first and then Peter?
Sure, Aisha, I can come in. So first of all, the GST outcome had, a very pioneering moment in the climate space where, all countries are now, pushed to transition away from fossil fuels. I think maybe just taking a little step back, the GST outcome also established, Mission 1.5, where, the Troika has been given a mandate to, in the spirit of international cooperation, encourage parties to submit 1.5 aligned NDCs. And as, as a part, or as the UAE being a part and the member of the Troika, our messaging or our will is to encourage parties to have NDCs that do make a difference, that are at the core of how each country takes forward ambitious climate action in their national policies and their plans and their effort. We want to build on the ambition of the UAE consensus, and to really try to deliver a 60% emission reductions by 2035, which is compared to, I believe, the 2019 levels. So as part of the Troika, we are trying to make progress or encourage parties to make progress towards being economy-wide and, covering all greenhouse gases that also include methane, and also accelerate action to 2030 to take decisive steps to implement a just, orderly, and responsible energy transition. In terms of the UAE nationally and how we have been taking forward the UAE consensus and the outcomes of the GST, I think one thing to mention is that ambition is very key in this part. The UAE is working towards to being an early mover and submitting its NDC before COP29. And, we are set to encourage collaboration with parties and try to ensure a drive into a new era of sustainable socioeconomic growth that would also keep 1.5 within reach, and that also advances prosperity and leaves no one behind. So I think the way we are looking at the transition is to focus on an orderly transition. And what does that mean? It means that we have to look at an all systems approach. We have to recognize that, as a primarily as a country that primarily focuses or relies heavily on fossil fuels, how do we use these challenges and opportunities to transform from a fossil-based economy to a knowledge-based green economy? And we recognize that we really did need a comprehensive and inclusive approach to sustainable development. So in working on our third NDC, this is what we've been trying to do. We've been trying to actively engage with all stakeholders, trying to understand what exactly is needed for an orderly transition away, but also taking into account sustainable and socioeconomic growth and prosperity for our economy at the same time. So bringing this back to ambition is really important, and it's very important that leadership notices that this is a priority for us, and how we're trying to integrate the transition is something that we're working on very diligently. For example, implementation is a very important factor here when it comes to transitioning away. And we have recently published our first climate law, which aims to implement the UAE consensus, but also implement the policies and the strategies that we are putting out in our third NDC. So I think it's also a question of education as well, trying to understand the needs and priorities of each sector. And as I said before, it's a systems transformation. So how do we collectively transform the systems in the energy sector, but also the systems that are directly linked to the energy sector? So it is a multi-stakeholder exercise. And this is what we're working on and trying to forward that transition, but also bearing in mind, safeguarding economic growth and prosperity for our people.
Thank you very much, Thoraya. Peter, would you maybe like to highlight on what does the transition away mean for the UNFCCC process and the parties? The COP28 was the first COP, since the negotiations started to adopt the text on the transition away from the fossil fuels. So what does that mean for the UNFCCC and the negotiations moving forward?
Thank you very much, Aisha. So I will respond in two parts. First, I'll speak how this decision will relate to the UNFCCC generally, and I also will make a brief comments on how this how in Singapore we see this decision as well. But let me begin by highlighting that I want to commend the UAE presidency for the excellent drafting of this paragraph. I think it's important that we read this very carefully, this paragraph, because it's not only about transitioning away, but there are a number of nuances and points in that decision that we need to take care of, be mindful of. So let me just highlight, and some of the points Thuraya had also has mentioned. So firstly, I just want to highlight that this is actually a global efforts. Okay, it is not, in a sense, there's a view. It's not national obligations as such, but certainly the direction of travel is very clear. All of us must work towards, transitioning away from fossil fuel. But we need to also bear in mind the phrase in that decision we talks about in a nationally determined manner. So in a sense, this decision recognizes the national circumstances of countries. I think that's very important. And the decision also talks about taking into account the different national circumstances, pathways, and approaches. So what I'm trying to say is that there's no singular pathway for all countries to transition away from fossil fuel because national circumstances are different. And the second point I just want to highlight, looking at the decision very carefully, it talks about in keeping with the science. So what does science say? So there is one view that the significance of the reference to science, the latest IPCC report did not actually totally, one way of looking at it is, did not foreclose the use of oil and gas beyond 2050. So I'm just raising this as a question. Again, transition cannot be immediate. Certainly ambition is important. So how do we factor the situation of countries who are highly dependent on fossil fuels currently as envisaged in Article 4.10 of the Convention? So I just raising that as well. Next point I just want to highlight is that the notion about just, orderly, and equitable manner. I think that's a very important choice of words, and the reference to the words equitable manner. So what does it mean? So I'm raising this as for reflection. So when we look at transition away from fossil fuel, we need to be mindful of these nuances as well. Last but not least, I just want to highlight that while there are these nuances, but the last line of the decision refers to accelerating action in this critical decade. So there need to be some fine balance between the situation of countries, but at the same time, the direction of travel is very clear. As Thuraya mentioned, there need to be ambition, acceleration of action in this critical decade. So that's from the broader UNFCCC process. Let me now say a few points on Singapore's approach on this decision as a small island city-state, which is alternative energy disadvantage. The first point I want to highlight is energy transition is extremely challenging for Singapore. Singapore is a small island city-state with a land area of only about 730 square kilometers. Singapore has one of the highest population densities globally. So that's our national circumstances. Due to our geographical constraints and the lack of natural resource endowment, Singapore faces unique challenges in transitioning to alternative energy sources. As acknowledged by the UNFCCC, Article 4.10 of the Convention, Singapore is an alternative energy disadvantaged country. We have limited or no potential for renewable energy options such as hydroelectric, tidal, wind, and geothermal power. Notwithstanding our acute constraints, Singapore has a long-standing commitment to the UN and the UNFCCC process. And we have played our part to support global climate action. In this regard, Singapore enhanced our NDC in 2022 in line with the Glasgow Climate Pact. We committed to reduce emissions to 60 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030 after peaking emissions earlier, and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Our pledge is backed by concrete actions as outlined in the Singapore Green Plan. This is our roadmap and all-of-nation movement towards sustainable development and net zero emissions. And currently, we are working to submit our next NDCs by the deadline in first quarter 2025. In respect to the Singapore Green Plan, I won't highlight all policies, but let me just flag two of the policies that we have adopted to support UNFCCC objectives. First, we have implemented a carbon price. Singapore's carbon tax covers around 80% of our national greenhouse gas emissions and has one of the highest coverages in the world. We have raised our carbon tax level fivefold to around $19 per ton of emissions at the start of 2024, and we will progressively raise it to $40 to $60 by 2030, making it one of the highest in Asia. The second point I want to highlight, second policy, is that I mentioned that we are alternative energy disadvantaged. We do not have renewable energy options. But nonetheless, despite this constraint, we are working to decarbonize our power sector by increasing solar deployment and harnessing green electricity imports from the region through regional grids. We are committed to deploy at least 1.5 gigawatt of solar by 2025 and 2 gigawatt by 2030, as well as 200 megawatt of energy storage systems beyond 2025. We are already halfway towards achieving our target of 2 gigawatt peak of solar deployment by 2030. And we are also targeting to import up to 6 gigawatt of low carbon electricity by 2035 by regional grids. So again, I want to emphasize, to realize all this, international cooperation is important. So countries should facilitate the transboundary movement of clean electricity for countries like Singapore, which are alternative energy disadvantaged. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And Thuraya, what I can take from both of your reflections on the UAE experience and Singapore experience, that different countries have different circumstances, are going to be affected differently by the transition away from the fossil fuels, and will have different approaches to transition to the energy transition. And I also take that the energy transition or transition away from the fossil fuel is a multifaceted and a non-linear process. So we need to keep that in mind. And it really, I think what you both mentioned is really goes to the point on the discrepancy between COP outcomes and the implementation. I can see from both UAE experience and Singapore experience that both countries are taking a proactive approach to the energy transition. I would like now also to pick up on the other important element, which is going to be the focus of the COP29, which is the climate finance. So how Azerbaijan plan to mobilize the climate finance this year, as it makes it the center of the COP29, and what are the challenges ahead for the climate finance mobilization?
So I have to admit, I'm not fully the finance expert, but as you mentioned, COP29 finance is going to play a very, very key role in the COP29 process. And I think, what we would like to see coming out of COP29 is that how do we make finance MOI, which would also include, for example, technology transfer, capacity building. How do we make that available at scale in a way that would be accessible to all and affordable to support developing countries, and also to implement, the Paris Agreement and the UAE consensus. So I think that's going to be a key factor in the discussions at COP29, and how do we ensure that climate finance institutions are well governed, how are they fairly represented, and how do they operate in a way that would provide clear guidance to effectively implement the principles of the Paris Agreement, and how do we ensure accountability and means of implementation within that space. So I think, as you're aware, the NCQG is going to be one of the key anticipated outcomes at COP29. And how are we going to work towards operationalizing that at the end of the year? So I think, the NCQG really does need to respond to the current evolving needs of developing countries. And, this could be in the amount of, the trillions, for example. But, I think it also needs to address key elements. We need to recognize and build trust and confidence in the space again. How do we restore trust that obligations will be fulfilled, how commitments will be met, and how do we build that confidence that finance will be available to support developing countries in meeting their NDCs? And how do we accelerate the reform of the international financial architecture to support that, to support the demand that is needed in climate action? And I think it's also, how do we leverage, the greater multiples of private finance and the capital in order to support this process? So I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation, and I really do hope that in the spirit of trust and confidence, the parties will be able to come up with, with a very strong finance outcome, which I think is going to be very much anticipated, by all parties. So I think those are my 2 cents worth on climate finance.
Well, thank you, Thoraya. You really highlighted in too many important points. So you do have the experience, actually. Peter, would you like to add to this?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, I'm not a finance expert either, but let me try to provide some perspectives. First, as I mentioned earlier, we welcome the efforts of the Troika, working together, leading efforts to reach a good outcome on finance in COP29, the NCQG. Yeah, some of our perspectives on this issue. First, in our view, the NCQG must be a practical improvement over what we have today by all measures, notably in quality and quantity. So in this regard, I just want to make 2 points. First, public finance must form the core of the NCQG to address the needs of developing countries, especially for projects where private financing is scarce, such as for adaptation. Second, public finance can then be supplemented by private and innovative finance, which actually Thoraya also mentioned. Second, this is very important when parties come with an agreement on the NCQG. It is important that parties do not deviate from the Paris Agreement, which is the foundational framework which unite countries in the fight against climate change. In this regard, Article 9 of the Paris Agreement clearly lays out the obligations regarding the provision of climate finance. Those obligations in the Paris Agreement were based on the principle that those who have contributed to the climate problem take responsibility and do more. I think we need to bear in mind and abide by the principles and provisions of the Paris Agreement, particularly Article 9. In this regard, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities underscores countries' different historical responsibilities regarding climate crisis. I think we need to bear that in mind as well. And I also want to highlight, per the principles and provisions of the Paris Agreement, developed countries must continue to take the lead in providing and mobilizing climate finance for developing countries in line with the Paris Agreement. So again, I want to emphasize, in coming with an outcome of the NCQG, it is important that the outcome is anchored in the provisions and principles that all parties have agreed to in the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So now I will open the floor for the questions. If anyone has questions, please write them in the Q&A chat function. But meanwhile, I do have, I can see 3 questions in the chat box. I will start with the question from Nadia Farhana. Bint Hassan. Her question is on there is often a gap between ambitious goals set at the COP sessions and the implementation on the ground. What role can regional collaborations between Southeast Asia and the Middle East play in accelerating climate action and bridging this gap? Can we start with you, Peter? I know like you are working with partners from the Gulf, from Saudi, for example, and the UAE. Have you witnessed any, areas of collaboration between Southeast Asia, for example, maybe Singapore and the Gulf countries?
Okay, thank you very much, Aisha, and also for that question. This question, if I can just paraphrase slightly to respond to that, is basically the thrust of the question is how the reality on the ground, climate negotiations versus the discrepancy with between outcomes and implementation. I think that's what the question is basically alluding at. So let me respond in the following manner. Having been a participant in the COP process over the last 17 years, I will ask the question and I will provide the answer as well. Is the UNFCCC perfect? Well, the answer is no. It is not. However, I will add, for a complex, multi-track, multi-year negotiating process, the UNFCCC has made material progress, especially after the adoption of the Paris Agreement. The COP since 2015 has built on each other, culminating in the UAE consensus, which I mentioned earlier, is the most substantive outcome. So in this regard, in terms of balancing the discrepancy between the negotiations and the challenges of the outcome as well, are we too slow? Well, my view is that when every COP need to set targets, because if you don't push forward, I don't think there will be ambition. We can't address the climate issue effectively. But at the same time, it is my view that there shouldn't be perennial negotiations. There must also be time for parties to implement what they have agreed to. So it should be a balance between vision, setting new targets, but at the same time, implementing targets that parties have agreed to. So in this regard, balance between new negotiations and implementation. In my view, the UAE consensus strikes this fine balance between adoption of new targets and yet emphasizing implementation. So I noted that the question also related to Southeast Asia. So again, when we talk about Southeast Asia, it is not a monolith grouping. It's heterogeneous. Even the countries, the 10 countries in Southeast Asia are not similarly situated. So the actions, for example, I mentioned about Singapore. Singapore is a small island city-state. Other countries in our region are bigger countries. They have more domestic mitigation options. So certainly the approach we are going to take will be different. So the pathways, each pathway of each of the 10 countries, a priori will be different. So, but while the pathways are different, but the direction of travel is set. So I remember actually a very good description of the Paris Agreement provided by the executive director of, who was the executive director in 2015, Cristina Figueres. When the Paris Agreement was adopted, I remember her describing the Paris Agreement as one of building a multi-lane highway. So basically the Paris Agreement has been built, the direction of travel is given, has been provided, is to move forward, raising ambitions. But at the same time, the Paris Agreement has many lanes. Countries travel in different lanes. Countries which have greater options, mitigation options, they can afford to travel on the faster lane. Others which are alternative energy disadvantage, or developing countries, small islands, which has major constraints, they can opt to travel on the slower lanes. But the point is, the direction of travel has been set, but how countries achieve their destination should be guided by the national circumstances. So even for a grouping in Southeast Asia, among the 10 countries, the pathways are going to be very different. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thuraya, did you want to add anything to the question on the collaboration between the Middle East and Southeast Asia?
I mean,
Right.
I think Peter, gave a very good summary of the approach. But I think in terms of collaboration, I mean, we, through the Troika, for example, we're trying our best to encourage cooperation with all parties, and I think it's mainly the point of opening the discussion and trying to understand priorities and how do we bridge, the priorities, opportunities, and challenges between each other, between the two regions. So I think that could be my little addition to a little bit of flavor to what Peter was saying a bit earlier.
Excellent. Okay, the other question is on the inclusivity of the COP29. Now, the COP28 last year have opened the green zone, which welcomed everyone, from the public, and those who are not really like having the badge to, enter the blue zone. So it opened the space for the private sector, as you mentioned, Thuraya, for the youth, and the NGOs and the entrepreneurs. Do we expect that COP29 is also going to be an inclusive COP this year?
Maybe I can start. So in terms of inclusivity, we 100% agree with you. I think in order to have success, we have to be inclusive. I mean, I understand that this is a multilateral space, for parties, but at the same time, we need to provide space for the private sector to kind of understand what the process is, what we're agreeing to, and how they can contribute to the conversation, and how they can actually provide insights, in the real economy, in the real world, and how, the translation from the multilateral space would trickle down into, into the private sector space. And I think COP28 really tried to work on that, as you said, in the blue zones, but also working on the action agenda initiatives, and also, having a lot of initiatives that incorporated the private sector, in, for example, the Global Renewables and Energy Efficiency Pledge, which, where countries, pledge to triple renewables and double energy efficiency, but also having, for example, I think there was the Industrial Transition Accelerator, which had, a partnership with, I think it was Bloomberg Philanthropy, the UNFCCC and GFANZ. How do we bring together leadership across the industry, across, finance and governments, to overcome these challenges, for example, in decarbonization? So I think there needs to be a space for inclusivity, to have those conversations and to see, where we can, accelerate the implementation process, for example. And I think another side of that was, trying to integrate the youth into the conversation as well, because, at the end of the day, it is the youth that are going to be taking over from us, and they have, a multitude of refreshing ideas, for example, also just how they view the world, and obviously this is going to be their future that we're currently talking about. So I think they definitely need to have a say, or maybe even like, an active understanding in what's happening right now in the negotiations. So, we did have a youth climate champion, and COP29, the incoming presidency, also does have one. And I think that is very important in continuing that discussion forward. I do believe that COP29 will focus on the concept of inclusivity as well, and trying to garner what we did at COP28 in trying to like harness that that initiative moving forward. And we do hope that this is something that continues and progresses over time and over the next COPs.
Thank you, Thoraya. Peter, did you wanted to add anything?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I fully agree with Thoraya on the importance of inclusiveness and transparency. So in this regard, I just want to highlight two things. I think one of the things that to me was an excellent from COP28, what the UAE did was the Majlis. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing correctly, the Majlis process, whereby the UAE presidency actually brought together groups of countries to discuss specific challenges in an open, bold, and solutions-oriented way. This promoted transparency, providing all parties an opportunity to engage. I think that's an excellent example, which should be certainly followed in Azerbaijan as well. I think that was excellent. The notion of the Majlis was actually excellent. The second point, I fully agree with Thoraya that it's important that we engage young people and the youth. In my role as the KCI chair, over the many COPs, actually I meet youth groups quite regularly. And one of the things that always struck me is that when we look at climate change, it is not an issue that concerns us today. It is not only it's not only an intragenerational issue. It is also an intergenerational issue. So therefore, I think it's important that that decision makers in the COP engage youth, because the impacts of climate change are not going to be felt now, but some of them are going to have long-term solutions. And our youth and our children and children's children will be experiencing the effects of climate change. And it's important that their views are taken on board so that we can have a very long-term sustainable solutions to all these very important issues that we are facing. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We do have 7 minutes left, and I want to go back to one important point that actually keeps coming in whenever like I want to host a COP meeting, webinar, I mean. It also came in the questions for this webinar, is the, the slow implementation of COP outcomes. We talked about it, but what is next? What will make COPs more effective in the next few years? And there's something that we didn't spoke about, is the submission of the transparency reports, whether the transparency reports will, foster countries' commitment to the climate action. I'll give like 2 minutes 3 minutes for each of you.
Sure. So in terms of the first part of your question, I think it's very important to understand the concept of multilateralism, albeit a slow process. I think it's a very important process that we do have in our international sphere. Getting 200 parties to have full consensus on issues is very challenging. But I think that's, maybe the beauty of multilateralism, where, everyone has a role to play, everyone has a say, and everyone has the possibility to, to make a decision and to come together to a decision. So I think although it does have maybe what we perceive to be slow implementation, I think it does garner the importance of the issue at hand. I think the fact that, we do have a space to talk about climate, we do have a space to highlight the importance of climate on a global scale, I think is a very important and a very, very meaningful point that we have. And I think the fact that COPs are getting bigger, COPs are getting more inclusive, it's not just become a space for negotiations of countries, it's become a space for people, to come and get their voices heard, to get to get more understanding on the topic. And I think that is something that we haven't seen in the past. And it really is creating a movement globally. And it's really highlighting how countries are willing to put emphasis in this space. So I do agree, maybe it is a little bit slow, but it's definitely what we need, you know, for us to progress. And I think in terms of, let's say, acceleration, it is up to, you know, it's a collective goal. It's a collective goal for, you know, all stakeholders, all people to come together and promote the importance of climate action. And then in terms of the second part of your question, the BTRs, I think the importance of the BTRs, in my mind, is the accountability, right? The accountability of the ambition that we are providing in this space. So, you know, the enhanced transparency framework, you know, it kicks off this year. You know, everyone is supposed to be submitting their first BTRs. And I think this gives a unique opportunity to increase accountability on actions, for example, through mitigation, through the NDC process, through adaptation, but also in terms of support, you know, in terms of finance and MOI. This is a very crucial point where developing countries can really highlight what they need in terms of support and what is required to progress on ambition. So I think BTRs are definitely very important, and I think, you know, submissions, you know, are definitely encouraged. But I think, yes, so it tackles both parts, the ambition and what is the support needed.
Thank you very much, Thoraya. Peter, last words.
Okay, no, basically, Thoraya has already spoke about vital transparency reports. I fully associate with comments that Thoraya had mentioned. But I just, as a final remark, I want to highlight that one of the documents that I've been reading very closely the last 10 months is the UAE consensus. I just want to say it's a very excellent document. And I mentioned about paragraph 191, the roadmap. But there's another few paragraphs to me is actually very fundamental. It's actually paragraph 153 to 163 is about international cooperation. Because climate change is a global problem, it requires a global solution. I think it requires the contribution and collaboration of all countries. So therefore, I think paragraph 153 to 163, in my view, goes to the heart of the issue. How can we as parties work together? We need to work together to solve the global climate problem. My last point, I want to leave with a positive note. Well, as the UN Secretary General said, the quote that I shared earlier, we are the problem, right? We cause climate change, but he also said we are the solution. I believe in the human spirit. Look at true history, human beings create a lot of problems, but human beings also solve the problems. So therefore, the COVID example demonstrates when countries collaborated, we actually took measures and addressed the problem. Therefore, I want to end on a positive note that I'm confident that the UAE consensus is an inflection point. It has put us in a position. I don't think there's going to be any turning back. And I'm confident that the Azerbaijan COP will build on that. And all of us must work to support an outcome. And together, I'm sure we will be able to address the climate crisis. So all of us must have a game in this climate crisis. So I just want to leave on that positive note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for ending with a positive note that we really need at those critical times. With that, we are coming to the end of today's webinar. I would like to really thank our esteemed speakers for your time and for making this discussion really fruitful. I learned a lot from both of you. And also, I would like to thank everyone who is joining us in the webinar. Thank you for sticking to the end. And with that, I'll see you again, and have a nice evening and have a nice day.